Millions of Americans in for a surprise on tax season when they find out the Obamacare penalty for not having health insurance could be a lot more than they thought. TurboTax estimates that the average fine will be more than $300, not $98. The book America's Bitter Pill breaks down the costs of Obamacare, and its author is highly critical of a health care system that will leave the taxpayer, he says, holding the bag. Stephen Brill's the author. He's my guest here in studio. Nice to see you here.
Nice to see you, Bill.
And good morning to you. Your book is 528 pages long, which I think makes it 2,172 pages shorter than the Obamacare law. Let's make it clear.
I hope it's a better read.
Let's hope, yeah, right? Especially for you. You're a fan of health care reform.
Yep.
You're a fan of Obamacare. But you're not a fan of how this law expects to be paid for. Make your case.
Well, I'm a fan of the idea that more people in this country have access to health care. What I think all Americans shouldn't like about it is that the way reform comes out of Washington is that the taxpayers are going to subsidize that care at the same ridiculously high prices for drugs, for staying in a so-called nonprofit hospital where they'll charge you $77 for a box of gauze pads. That's what we shouldn't be a fan of, which is keeping the same ridiculously high price structure and adding at the taxpayers'
expense, that they pick up the bill.
Tens of millions of new customers.
There were many people before this bill was passed who made the same argument. Now, Republicans would argue that this is how Democrats get laws passed. And they'd point to a comment like this from Nancy Pelosi, who was the House Speaker at the time, March 2009.
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it away from the fog of the controversy.
Check that. That's March 2010. That was exactly 2 weeks before the bill was signed into law. So is this how Washington works?
Well, it is how Washington works.
Get the bill passed, get it on the books, and worry about the expense later.
Well, the bill is stuffed with little attempts to fix a terribly complex, broken healthcare system, and what you get when you try to do that, as opposed to reforming it, is the kind of complexity that nobody can understand, and people are still trying to understand it. You said at the beginning of the show that people are going to pay a higher penalty than they thought. Well, in part, that's because the press never reported that the penalty was that high. But for many people,
I think you would have heard that here on Fox News Channel.
Oh, for sure. But if you picked up the typical newspaper, it said 1%. But for many people, it's going to be a lot worse because the subsidies apply in a very rigid way. For example, there's a couple in my book who make $64,000 a year, and they get a $9,000 subsidy on their $14,000 a year health care policy. If they make $64,050 a year, the $9,000 subsidy goes away. It falls off the cliff.
I mean, there
so
you
that
find
if they didn't estimate their income the right way, they are really in trouble.
If you look back in the last 100 years on big national social programs, don't you find that this is the habit of Washington? Pass the bill, sign it, we'll worry about the finances down the road. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and now the argument you make about Obamacare. Is that not the case?
It gets worse, though. I think it gets worse as the years go on because the interests in Washington build up their power, and they can keep tacking different things on to bills like this that have hidden costs that nobody knows about.
With regard to Obamacare, though, is it now too big that it can't be fixed?
I think what's going to happen is it's here to stay. I don't think it's going to be overturned, and I don't think it's going to be taken away. But I think the only cause for hope is actually a pretty grim cause, which is that things will get so bad in terms of the cost that the people will finally rise up and say, we can't do business this way in Washington anymore.
When does that happen?
We have to reform the healthcare system.
Is there a time frame on that
This
theory?
country only governs well when there's a crisis. We do well when there's a crisis. Because when there's a crisis, the lobbyists lose their power and the people start to get their power back because they insist on it. That is the only sort of perverse hope for reform here, which is that things get so bad that they'll get better.
Well, just one thing quickly, and I only have 15 seconds, and I apologize for lack of time. Why do you believe those who voted for it did not pay attention to detail?
Oh, I think those who voted for it did pay attention to detail. I think they knew exactly what was going to happen.
Wow, that's even more shocking. Stephen Brill, thank you. America's Bitter Pill. Good luck, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in today.
Happy to do it.
All right.